Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today I'm going to be talking to you about this. This is a very special Sega Dreamcast that I recently acquired that I'm basically going to be doing a review on for you. Now, at this point in time, I haven't used it a whole lot. I just kind of have a basic knowledge of how it's going to, go, what it is. We'll talk about that, and at the end of the video, after I've used it a bunch, I'll give you final thoughts. So a little backstory on this thing. Obviously, it's a Sega Dreamcast, but it has had a couple of modifications done to it, which is what we're going to talk about. Now, last summer, the summer of 2017, I was in Austria briefly. While I was there, I was contacted by another dude named Jan who lives in Austria. He saw on like Twitter or Facebook that I was there, and he was just like, "Hey man, I don't know exactly where you are, but do you want to meet up? I kind of want to like give you this Dreamcast I've been working on, or alternatively, I could mail it to you." So I was like, well, I can't really meet up with you, but if you want to mail it to my friend in Austria that I'm staying with, that could work out. And he did. So it showed up, and we tinkered with it a little bit, and then I brought it back here to do a review. And now finally I have time to actually do the review. So let's get into it. Now basically, he did two modifications to this. The first is a simple region switch modification. By default, this is a Japanese Dreamcast, and it's actually in pretty good shape. But he added a dev kit BIOS to it, which allows it to play North American games and European games in addition to its native Japanese games. There's a switch on the back that allows you to switch between the two. So it defaults to Japanese, or you put it into the BIOS mode, and it can play all three. That's kind of a standard modification, but the primary reason one would care about this modification is that he also did this. You'll see this thing just kind of sticking out of the side of it. This is a CF card. Now, a CF card, if you're not familiar, is basically like an SD card. It's just that it was a different format, and it really never received the same level of popularity. In Europe, it was more popular than it was in North America, but that said, it's just a media storage format, basically. Gamers would probably know it best as that big card slot on the front of a PS3. They were on there in the original fat PS3s. Primarily they were used in cameras, and the reason one would use them is that they're vastly more reliable than SD cards. SD cards, while common, cheaper, and even bigger, memory-wise, do tend to break down rather quickly, whereas these do not. That's just kind of how it was. So that's what he ended up going with because he wanted a longer sense of longevity out of the product. So he inserted a card slot in there. He made this himself, and I gotta give credit where credit's due. Just like looking straight at it, it looks factory. Like, this is a beautiful modification. Like, I know people have all sorts of mixed feelings about these kind of big switches on the back, but this is special. Like, this looks factory, man. Like, if Sega put a CF card reader on it, it probably would have looked exactly like that. So that's very nice. Now, you're probably like, well, okay, what is the point of that? Well, the basic point is that it allows you to allows the Dreamcast to interpret the card and play games off of the card. This might sound familiar. It's kind of been done before with the GDMU and the USB GD, both things I've done videos on. However, this is a little different because unlike those where you had to sacrifice your GD-ROM to install those, the GD-ROM is where it plays discs. As you can see, this one still has its disk drive, and that essentially means that this Dreamcast can read discs, or it can play games off of the CF card. See why that might be useful? So that's pretty neat. However, it could potentially have downsides, namely that it has to run through Dreamshell. So what happens is when you turn this on, there's a different operating software on the card. The Dreamcast reads that and then loads into that, and then you're basically using Dreamshell to run things. Now that has plenty of goods and it has plenty of negatives, but I haven't tested it out fully, so that's what we're going to do right now.
Okay, I got my Dreamcast all set up here on a nice cardboard box because I am like legit as shit. Anyway, so I turned it on just to prove there's no disc in there, and you can see that the card is what the console boots do. Now we just switched over to captured footage because there's no reason to just stare at a TV screen the whole time. Did you think we were going to do that? We're not going to do that. So that's the dev kit BIOS, and then when you go from that, it goes to that little black screen you saw with some text. Looks very DOS-like. That's basically the Dreamcast booting up into that, and then here you have Dreamshell. Now, this is the actual load times. I didn't crop anything out. When you're presented, you get this Dreamshell screen, which has all sorts of different options on it. The game icons are not normal. I'll be explaining that in a little while. But Dreamshell has a few different features, including file management, GD Ripper, which allows you to rip discs, GD Play, which is basically if you put a disc in, you can use that to boot the actual disc, ISO Loader to load burned games, or if you want to call them that, load ISOs. You can region change, you can go to settings, and the VMU Manager to manage data. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of games on here. So you might be asking, like, well, what do I need that ISO loader thing for? Well, this is kind of special circumstances. I'll explain that later, but it's cool because you can use it to run things like Millennium Racer. This game was never even released, but here it is. Or Half-Life Gold and Half-Life Paranoia are never released officially, and there they are. You can play really rare games like Mars Matrix, unreleased games like Propeller Arena again. And, you know, imports like Taxi 2 is European, Shenmue 2 is European. It also plays the Japanese stuff and the American stuff, etc. So basically, region isn't a problem, is basically the point I'm making there. And you can use it to test out all sorts of cool stuff. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of games in there. And later on in the video, I'm going to explain how that actually works. It looks, right now it's very nicely set up, and that's important to note. But it takes a couple of extra steps, but we'll get to that later. Right now, I'm just going to pop in Propeller Arena. As you can see, it has its own little load screen, and then there you go. You're just right in the game. Now, load times are better because it's not rating off of the disc. And that's always, you know, that's nice to have good load times. I cut out some stuff just to give you a sample of Propeller Arena. I don't know if you guys have ever played this, but this game is actually really cool. It was made by AM2, which is the Shenmue team, basically, which was Yu Suzuki's personal studio. They basically made this game right at the end of the Dreamcast. Like, it was done. It just wasn't released, largely in part because of 9/11. There is a level in this game where that actually has the Sears Tower here in Chicago, that you can like fly your planes into it and shit. And it's like, I guess Sega just decided they wanted to avoid that PR nightmare. But fortunately, I mean, the game has nothing to do with terrorism or anything like that. It's just, I guess they just weren't comfortable with it. But ultimately, it got onto the internet so you could try it. But yeah, it's a fun game if you've never checked it out. But my point is, it worked.
Okay, so I've been using this for a while, and it's time for final thoughts. So there's the Dreamcast itself is a Dreamcast. There's no reason to review it. So obviously, we're just going to focus on the modifications. Now, there's really just the two modifications. One, of course, is the region-free switch on the back, which there isn't a whole lot to say, but I will address it. If you intend to use that switch in region-free mode, make sure you keep the CF card installed, because if you were to remove the card and to keep it in region-free mode, you might be thinking, well, the card doesn't matter, I'll just put in a different region disc and it'll just play that way. Nope, doesn't work that way. You have to have the CF card installed. If you try to run the Dreamcast in region-free mode without the CF card installed, you basically get a screen from Dreamshell kind of asking where it should load itself from, and it never goes beyond that. So just leave the card in at all times if you intend to use the region-free mode. Otherwise, you just leave it in stock mode if it's Japanese. In my case, this one happens to be a Japanese Dreamcast. When talking to Jan about what you would potentially order, you know, that can vary if you want a North American, Japanese, or European Dreamcast. But that's up to you guys to figure out. Either way, if you're going to leave it in stock mode, that's one option, just to play a native disc. But most of the time, you really don't have a reason to switch it into native mode unless you're trying to run, like, you know, a GDR or something like that. But that's a rare situation. But anyway, so aside from that, there isn't a whole lot to say on the region-free switch. Potentially, you could dislike the aesthetic of that particular type of switch, but that doesn't bother me, so that's up to you. Especially because it's in the back of the console, and once it's there, you generally don't see it, and it doesn't really affect things. So let's focus on the meat and potatoes of this whole thing, the CF card slot. Now, as I mentioned before, from a hardware perspective, this is beautiful. He did this flawlessly. It's flush, it looks perfect, it looks like Sega did it. It just looks stock, you know, for lack of a better word. So, incredible job on that. So the only complaints I guess I have about this particular Dreamcast has nothing to do with Jan's work, because again, from a hardware perspective, it's perfect. The problem is the software. The problem is Dreamshell. Dreamshell, you have to understand, is basically mediating software between the Dreamcast and the games. The Dreamcast was not designed to basically have a master and slave system in place, which is what this setup kind of does. Basically, it allows you to either boot from the disc or boot from the card. And so Dreamshell created a whole bunch of extra features, but it's essentially the Dreamcast is running software called Dreamshell, and then Dreamshell has to run other software. So you've got a hat on a hat. And as a result, the hat, the first hat, aka Dreamshell, has to be perfect in order for the other hat to fit correctly. But Dreamshell isn't perfect, and that's unfortunately where a lot of the problems come in. So it has pluses and it has minuses. So let's talk about one of the pluses of Dreamshell, and especially with this particular setup. Dreamshell has in it a feature that allows you to rip discs. And with Jan's setup here, you can basically take a Dreamcast disc, pop it in there, run the Dreamshell ripping software, and it'll rip it to the SD card. Now, I cannot express enough how valuable that is. Now, I'm someone who likes to back up all my discs, not for piracy, but to actually verify my discs that I've bought to make sure that they actually work. Just putting your discs in a console and booting them up, seeing if they boot, that's not enough. You have to actually rip the discs to make sure there's no damaged sectors, and you'll be, unfortunately, very depressed at how often they fail, because you realize, oh shit, one of those used games I got wasn't actually perfect. So in my opinion, it's very important to verify your discs, and I mean, this might be overkill, but to do it every few years to make sure you're not suffering disc rot and stuff like that. The Dreamcast is notoriously painful to do that with. Despite how easy it is to pirate, because everyone just burns the rips that already exist, it's actually one of the hardest consoles to rip the discs off. In fact, other than maybe the Wii U, I can't think of one that's actually harder. And so to do that, you require an understanding of broadband networking, and as well as actually possessing the broadband adapter for the Dreamcast. Essentially, there's a lot of components required to be able to rip Dreamcast discs. This is so much easier. It is sick. You can put the disc in, rip it straight to the card, and then after it's done, you can take the card, pop it in your computer, and there's the data, a perfect one-to-one rip of it. Now here's where it gets ironic. Dreamshell and this modification allows you that a beautiful opportunity. But at the same time, if I take that data, and I pop that data, all the Dreamcast raw files, if I pop that onto an SD card and I stick it in the GDMU, no problem, it'll play it. I take that exact same data and I pop it into a flash card, and I stick that in the USB GD, 95% probability it's going to play it. I take that exact same data and put it into this card and try to play it off of the this version of the Dreamcast using Dreamshell, most likely it's not going to work. And that, again, not the hardware's problem, that's Dreamshell's problem. Dreamshell just has massive compatibility issues with games. So in order to get games to work, there's actually a whole big list of games that are compatible, and there has to be, they basically have to have been retooled and reskinned and changed in a lot of ways in order to work. Most of the time it's not the perfect one-to-one rip, it's actually like the CD compressed version that usually has like the worst music or the worst video, and is usually much smaller. Instead of the normal Dreamcast 1.1 gigabyte data size, they can be as small as, like, you know, a matter of like 100 megabytes, you know, something like that. A lot of the dummy files are extracted, basically less is more, if you will, trying to get down to the meat and potatoes of a game just to try and make it work. You'd have to talk to Jan specifically about which games work and how to go about getting them and all that stuff. I'll put his information in the description. You want to contact him about getting one of these Dreamcasts and getting the compatible games. He's your guy. That's not my department. But so once you have those rips, the ones that are verified to work, then it's easy as shit. You just take those games, and when you get the card, Jan will have already made a big, pre-directory with Dreamshell installed, plus all the game directories. And depending on whatever you talk to him about, it may or may not come with games. That's kind of up to you and him to figure out. But you can take those games and just plop them into the appropriate folders, and then you can essentially just play them. Now, there is one technical note to notice here. You noticed earlier in that footage I showed you of Dreamshell that it showed a desktop and then it showed you a whole bunch of icons of different games. That's something that's kind of exclusive to Jan's little adaptation of Dreamshell here. Those desktop icons are not stock with a Dreamshell. Basically what that means is you can't just put a game on the folder and then it just creates, a desktop icon for it. Jan actually went to the painstaking efforts of making desktop icons for every single compatible game, and he includes all of them in a backup directory on the Dreamshell folder system inside of this card. So what you do, if you want to, let's say I took Cannon Spike or something like that. I don't even remember if Cannon Spike's compatible, but if it is, let's just say it is. I would take the compatible build of Cannon Spike and throw it into the appropriate game directory. Then I would go into the desktop icon area and take the corresponding Cannon Spike desktop icon, clone it, and then throw it into the actual main desktop icon. That way when I boot up the Dreamcast, there is a Cannon Spike desktop icon, and Cannon Spike is actually on the card, so just click it and boom. Now, you don't have to do that. There is actually a software in Dreamshell called ISO Loader. If you click on that, it'll allow you to go into the bowels of your CF card and actually manually find it. So basically, one extra step on the PC saves you a whole bunch of extra steps on the Dreamcast. But you don't have to do it, it's just kind of a nicety. But it's something cool that Jan did. So I don't know if there's a whole lot to say beyond that, other than to just kind of hope that Dreamshell gets updated. And I'm sure it will at some point. Dreamshell does get periodic updates. At the moment, the hardware is perfect. It's all there. Everything he did is exactly what it's supposed to be, and it's very good at being what it's supposed to be. But currently, Dreamshell is what's limiting it. So as Dreamshell updates, this gets even better and better over time. Fortunately, updating it, once the updated version of the software is out, is pretty simple. You would just take the card, pop it in your PC, and just drag and drop the update files onto the card. It'll rewrite and then put it back in, and you have the updated version now, hopefully more compatible with more versions and all that stuff, which would be fantastic. So yeah, I guess that is kind of it. There's not really, I can't really think of anything else that I have to say about it. So I guess my #1 recommendation for its existence in its current state is if you're into backing up your Dreamcast disc. I seriously cannot stress enough how valuable this console, this particular build of the console, is for that purpose. But if you're looking at this as like, I want that Dreamcast because it'll play every disc game I've got and it'll play all the digital versions, I can just do that if I want, it'll be flawless. It's not there yet. The hardware is, the software is not. So keep that in mind. But down the road, as Dreamshell updates, it very well could be exactly that. So I guess that is really it. Thank you very much to Jan for doing this, for supplying this, allowing me to do the review, and thank you guys for watching. I'll see you all later.